In our last session, Paul went on his farewell tour, and he said goodbye to a number of people. He is making his way to Jerusalem. And I want you to pay attention over these final two sessions as we go from Acts 21 all the way to Acts chapter 28 to a couple things that are going to play out. First of all, I want you to notice Paul's faith that even though he is going to be persecuted, he is going to continue to proclaim the gospel. That actually frames up the two titles for this session and our next session. We are, as a part of our backstory, a persecuted people or a persecuted church. At the same time, in the midst of that persecution, we are a proclaiming church. You're going to see Paul do this in this particular section of text. But Paul is making his way, notice he's making his way to Jerusalem. Luke, as he writes, both the Gospel of Luke and what we know as the book of Acts, has continued to frame it up as what scholars call a travel narrative or a quest narrative. And in Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 51, remember, Luke says this about Jesus. He set his face resolutely to go to Jerusalem. And the entire narrative in Luke from that point on is Jesus making his way to Jerusalem. And you know what happens to him there. You know that story. It's our backstory. In fact, a couple things that I want to pay attention to. Number one, we have this story of Jesus cleansing the temple. We're going to find some chaos in the temple in this story as well. Number two, we find a story of a trial. In fact, time slows down as Jesus is put on trial. And we find some characters there as a part of Jesus' trial in Jerusalem. We find a high priest, and we find a king by the name of Herod Antipas. We also find a Roman governor by the name of Pilate. Some of those same characters in the Gospel of Luke and Jesus' journey to Jerusalem are now going to be echoed as Luke in Acts chapter 21, as Luke tells the story of Paul going to Jerusalem. So Acts 21, now all the way through 28, is going to tell this story of Paul going to Jerusalem, but then it's really just a pit stop because ultimately Paul's going to go to Rome. We're going to get him to Jerusalem in this particular session because as Paul gets there, you're going to notice a few things. You're going to notice an echo of Jesus' story. In fact, as we look at this, there's some parallels not only with the city, but there's some parallels with the temple. And there's also some parallels when it comes to the trial. And so if I could outline our session today, I want us to notice some of these outlines. Now, number one, we're moving toward Jerusalem. As Paul makes his way there, he finds himself first actually in Caesarea, back in the capital, what would be the Roman capital. We'll actually make our way back there, a little bit of a pit stop again before we get to Rome. And Paul is going to be on trial there multiple times. Here in Acts 21, as Paul has made his farewell tour and had his farewell address with the elders in Ephesus, he's going to do some of the same things still on his way to Jerusalem. But one of the things you'll notice as he stays with Philip, remember him from Acts chapter 7, and his 4 daughters who prophesy, there's another prophet who comes by the name of Agabus. And Agabus comes and takes off his belt and binds Paul with his belt and prophesies that this is what Paul is facing as he goes to Jerusalem. If he goes to Jerusalem, he's going to suffer. He's going to be persecuted, and he's going to face some of the same things that Jesus faced in Jerusalem. And so as Agabus prophesies over Paul, Paul then responds. And Paul responds with this faith. Notice in Acts 21, verse 13, what Paul says. What are you doing? They had all been urging him not to go. What are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? For I am not only ready to be imprisoned, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of Jesus. And since he would not be persuaded, we ceased. In other words, Luke is part of this crowd asking Paul, pleading with Paul not to go to Jerusalem. He says, and since he would not be persuaded, Luke says, we ceased asking him, and we said, let the will of the Lord be done. Do you hear some echoes from the story of Jesus? Even as Paul makes his way to Jerusalem, your will be done, not mine. Remember in the Gospels where Jesus was actually going, this is in John's account, going to Jerusalem to heal Lazarus. The disciples knew that as they went toward Jerusalem, their lives, not just Jesus's, but their lives were at risk. And so they said, hey, if he's going there, let's go and let's die with him. So as we make our way again, because of this backstory, as we make our way again to Jerusalem from Caesarea, you need to hear kind of this amplifying music in the background, this intensity of the plot line as we make our way to Jerusalem. It's part of the backstory. Paul's now said his farewells. There's foreshadowing of what's going to take place because the prophet Agabus has foreshadowed what's going to take place. And now as Paul enters Jerusalem, we get word that the good news has spread. Gentiles and Jewish people everywhere are responding to the gospel. But part of the problem is also this. Rumors have also spread about Paul. And so trouble follows Paul into Jerusalem. And we see believers who are following him, but also we see those who are opposing Paul follow him. Specifically, they're coming from Asia, that region around Ephesus. Remember all of the problems caused there? And they're making their way into Jerusalem. And so there's a rumor that starts to spread about Paul. You can read about it, but one of the rumors is this, is that Paul is bringing Gentiles into the temple. And this rumor causes a riot. Now, you can hear echoes of this, can't you? Jesus actually in the temple cleanses the temple. I believe he does it twice, once in John at the beginning of his ministry, and then again in his last week, we see Jesus cleansing the temple. And if you're familiar with that story, he's cleansing the courtyard of the Gentiles. And part of that protest or that prophetic moment of Jesus is this cleansing of the court of Gentiles, this house of prayer that's supposed to be for them to have access to come and worship God. Now we have this accusation that Paul has actually brought a Gentile from that courtyard past the barrier, which if you know archaeology, perhaps you know, we actually have part of that barrier as a find that prohibits Gentiles to cross that barrier into the inner courtyards. Well, that's the rumor, is that Paul has actually taken Trophimus, an Ephesian, past that barrier and thus defiled the temple. And so we have this chaos, this riot that breaks out. And in chapter 21, verse 30, we see this. They seize Paul and they drag him out of the temple. And now I want to pay attention to another aspect of what is taking place as we move through this narrative. If you remember us talking about this two-part series, Luke and then Acts, you'll remember that we said the temple is really important for Luke. In Luke's gospel, you'll notice the birth narratives, the Christmas story of Jesus. Many of the scenes take place in the temple. But moving throughout Luke's gospel, you'll notice an emphasis of the temple. We have, when it comes to Jesus being 12 years old, him coming to the temple and him talking about needing to be about his father's business or a part of his father's house. You'll notice the temptations in Luke's account, unlike Matthew's account, end in the temple or on the pinnacle of the temple. And you'll notice that even Luke's gospel itself ends with Jesus in the temple. And so the temple is an important feature, we would even say an important geographical marker in Luke's gospel. Not only do we need to get to Jerusalem, we need to get to the temple. But notice what happens here in chapter 21, verse 30. It's kind of this eerie, weird comment. And scholars don't always know what to do with it. In fact, I want to just tease up for you. I think there's more going on here than just the historical fact of something that took place. Notice what it says. Then the city was stirred up. The people ran together. They seized Paul. They dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, the tribunal comes out and interrupts this moment. But it's that phrase, that kind of haunting phrase. The gates of the temple were shut. And with that, we have our last scene in Luke's account of both the Gospel of Luke and Acts, the last scene that takes place in the temple. The last scene, similar to the Gospels. Think about the temple curtain being torn in half and torn in two, because why? Jesus provides access. And now we have this, what I believe to be an indictment of not the temple itself as a structure, but an indictment of the leaders over the temple as they arrest Paul and even a foreshadowing, same way with that tearing of the temple curtain, that no longer do we need to go to the temple to find access to God. Now we go through Jesus, and Paul in this moment prefigures some of that. I think this little statement, the gates of the doors were shut, is a little bit of a prefiguring of this truth of this last scene. Obviously, that even points forward. Jesus would do this more explicitly. He would point forward to 70 AD and the destruction of that temple that would take place. And Jesus points that same direction. Here we have kind of this prophetic little aside that says, hey, no longer are the people of God going to come in here as a part of their worship. And at least that's part of what I think Acts narrative is doing with that particular phrase. So notice, we've gone from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now we've gone into the temple, and this mob arrests Paul. Now, as Paul's arrested, by the way, the Tower of Antonia, the fortress of Antonia, overlooks the temple compound, which is 30 soccer fields large. It's a huge complex. So it's not really all that surprising that the crowd could get stirred up and that the Romans would need to respond. And so this Roman tribunal and soldiers respond to this violence. Their job is to keep the peace on behalf of Rome. And Paul is then arrested. Now, here's what's interesting, is we actually get probably what I would call the pre-trial. And we're going to be in that throughout the rest of our time together in this session. But there's some questions that start to happen about Paul in this phase of his trial. The tribunal has arrested him, and notice there's some prejudgment that takes place. By the nature of the riot, they actually prejudge. There's some bias here that Paul is something that he's not. And then you'll notice in chapter 21, Paul actually speaks Greek to this tribunal. And the tribunal's like, hey, wait, you know Greek? I thought you were that Egyptian who was stirring up a revolt. No, he doesn't know Greek. No, Paul says, no, I'm from Tarsus. In fact, I'm a citizen of no obscure city. And Paul then asks, hey, will you let me make a defense to the people? Then as he makes a defense to the people, notice at the end of chapter 21, he makes his defense in what the ESV says is the Hebrew language, thus Aramaic, what would be the street language. And so there's this pre-trial, this bias that's there, that the tribunal automatically thinks one thing about him, and the crowd automatically thinks one thing about him bringing a Gentile into the temple. And there's all these false accusations that are there. In fact, notice this when it comes to our backstory in the gospel, some of these stories that continue to play out in chapter 21, all the way to the end to chapter 28. We've already said the characters become similar. We'll talk about that more next session. But notice the prejudgment. In Jesus' trial, did we have trumped up charges that were made up? Did we have people jumping to conclusions, already deciding before the trial that Jesus was guilty? In fact, I would even argue this was some of the pre-trial that took place of Jesus' story at night, and this mob mentality, this pre-trial of Paul, was it actually outside of the Roman justice system, or what we would consider just and what they would consider just? Yeah, it was. We find some of those same echoes. A couple more echoes. You'll notice that Paul is going to be nearly flogged. In fact, it's not until he comes and says, hey, do you know that I'm actually a Roman citizen, that stops that flogging. We have a flogging that takes place, and we might even add the word interrogation to that, that is about ready to take place for Paul when he says, no, I'm actually a Roman citizen. And the tribunal says, how did you gain your citizenship? Like, I had to buy mine. You could, at this time of Roman history, purchase yours or have a benefactor who gave it to you. You could serve in the military, or you could actually be born. And so we'll see this dialogue that takes place, and there's some prejudgment there, but Paul actually says, no, I'm a Roman citizen. That actually changes the entire nature of this trial. And so you'll notice that there's a potential flogging that takes place. You'll see as you read through chapter 22, there's actually an assassination plot. Does it sound like people trying to kill Jesus? And you'll see throughout this entire time that Paul, as he faces this persecution, continues to proclaim and continues in faith and trust and confidence, no matter what happens, that Jesus has got this. you're going to find another interesting thing. In fact, kind of going all the way down through this first phase of the trial as he is before Felix, and as you see the assassination plot of the Jewish people trying to assassinate Paul when he's on the way, and Felix extradites him and gets him out back to Syria again, or Caesarea again we go. So we see Paul going from Jerusalem to Caesarea. As Paul makes his way there, we discover that eventually this court case is actually going to be buried. Felix, because it's not going to be politically advantageous to him, is going to leave Paul in prison. In fact, he's going to bring Paul out, but it's going to be 2 years that it's going to go by. And Paul's going to be in prison for 2 years in Caesarea. And part of the motivation is perhaps a bribe, but part of the motivation is actually power. Because if Felix does what is just and lets Paul go, he'll have a political problem with the powers that be back in Jerusalem, back in the temple. This should remind you of something. Because part of what we discovered in Jesus' trial is Pilate, the governor, a governor who's named Pilate, who also has some of these same political motivations. In fact, he knows that Jesus is innocent. We're going to see this, especially in our next session. Multiple times as you read through chapters 22 through 28, you're going to hear those who are responsible for carrying out a just trial of Paul say things like this: he's not deserving anything that would be deserving of death. He's innocent. He should be able to be released. And that's the same thing we have with Pilate. Multiple times, he's innocent. What do you want me to do with him, though? And Pilate finds himself politically in a pretty tight spot. We can get more into that in our study of Luke. But he finds himself in a political spot to where he can either let Jesus go and lose his power, or maintain his power and allow whatever they want to happen to Jesus to happen to him, thus the crucifixion. Paul's in prison for 2 years for some of the same reasons. And in fact, once we get to our next session, you'll discover the next governor, by the name of Festus, there's a name for you. The next governor is only going to bring up this case out of the motivation to do a favor for the Jewish leaders back in Jerusalem. So here we have Paul, and he finds himself in Herod's praetorium, in Herod's palace in Caesarea. You can go there today, by the way, and stand in that very location on the harbor where Paul is under arrest. And yet, one of the things we see in Paul's faith is that even when he's persecuted, even when he's in prison, Paul is going to use it as a platform to proclaim the gospel of Jesus. We're going to see that continue in our next session. But let me close with asking you this question. Notice all the persecution, all the circumstances that could cause Paul to just fold up and fold in and throw in the towel and quit. And yet Paul sees persecution and problems as platforms to proclaim the gospel. Maybe in some of your difficulties, part of what Acts wants us to see is as we're on a journey with Jesus, maybe we can actually start to see opportunities, even in some of our difficulties, to proclaim the gospel of hope, even when it looks like all is despair. We'll talk about that more in our next session.